you're so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
The issue of whether COVID vaccines should have their intellectual property protections waived is currently one of the most important debates in terms of the pandemic. Many countries right now are going through a major third wave, especially developing countries now are going through a third wave of infections, and it seems that there's just not enough vaccines to supply the global demand. Proponents of waiving intellectual property protections argue that if this IP waivers were provided, then countries that have pharmaceutical manufacturing capability could be able to produce the vaccines even without having a license to do so. However, opponents of IP waivers have argued that this would set a slippery slope in which companies in the long run would not have an incentive to develop vaccines. As you can imagine, this debate is very split among left and right. Leftists generally are supporting measures to allow IP waivers so that countries could produce vaccines, whereas right-wingers insist that IPs are an integral part of how the global economy works, and we can't even just give one exception, even in the most economically devastating pandemic since the Black Death. So, knowing this, I discovered a London-based think tank known as the Geneva Network. And I'm going to talk about the article that they wrote first, and then I'm going to go and investigate a bit what the Geneva Network is. But the title of this article is IP Rights Are Key to COVID-19 Vaccines. So, by that title, we can safely assume that this is a broadly free market think tank. But let's read some of the important bits in this article and see what they get completely wrong. So, the rapid development of new COVID-19 vaccines and treatments over the past year is a triumph of innovation. Billions of vaccine doses are being manufactured and should be distributed to all adults globally over the next 18 months. But health NGOs and some governments argue that suspending IP rights to allow unfettered vaccine manufacture will mean faster access for developing countries. They go on to say, such calls are morally appealing but misguided. IP has played a vital role in every step of vaccine research, manufacturing, and distribution. In January 2020, we knew very little about COVID-19. A year on, 3 safe and effective vaccines have been developed and authorized for use in record time with more than 1,000 ongoing clinical trials. Okay, so it is true that the speed in which we have researched COVID and developed COVID vaccines has been unprecedented. But there's a few issues here. So a lot of the core research behind, for example, mRNA vaccines, which are currently the ones being developed by Pfizer and Moderna, a lot of this was publicly funded in the years before the pandemic. In fact, most raw research is publicly funded. Private funding of research and development generally goes into the areas of innovation that have commercial areas that they could exploit, money-making areas of research. So, if we have an unknown disease, clearly pharmaceutical companies are not going to be investing in the technology for vaccines that still haven't appeared, right? So the core research for these vaccines was usually done by universities, public research labs, some degree of private research as well, but it is a fact that the grand majority of pharmaceutical research that is private funded is that which is applicable for commercial purposes. So they're not going to spend on a vaccine for a disease that still hasn't existed, right? Now, the truth is there's another factor why vaccines were developed in such a quick time. And that has nothing to do with the incredible research efforts by these companies. The fact is, during a pandemic, you have a lot of sick people to try vaccines on. You can basically shorten the time that you can do, for example, phase 3 clinical research if you have hundreds of thousands of cases at the same time. This is not possible with other diseases where you have only a limited population in which to get a sample size that is necessary to reach conclusions regarding effectiveness and safety, etc. So during a vaccine, we have more sick people, we can test vaccines much quicker. And that's why when they've said most vaccines takes years to develop, that's precisely why, because most illnesses that require these vaccines aren't affecting millions of people around the world at a single moment. So let's, just calm down and not give the impression that this was some, the development of these vaccines was entirely due to the efforts of private pharmaceutical companies. Anyway, IP rights allow potential rivals to cooperate and share valuable proprietary knowledge because they know that it is legally protected from misuse. The Pfizer-BioNTech partnership behind the first vaccine to be authorized in the US would not have taken place without strong IP rights. Really? This seems strange because it assumes that before the age of before the era of our current IP regime, which is relatively recent, it's pretty much post 1990s. There were no tech partnerships at all. It's actually relatively when you have a partnership, you establish contracts, and within those contracts you establish the framework in which you allow other companies to use your technologies. This has nothing to do with IP rights. So IP rights don't really affect the way in which two companies can formally collaborate. Because if one of those companies, for some reason, misuses a technology that the other supplied to it, you can get sued. There are financial consequences to this kind of action. IP rights are basically there to prevent companies from taking technologies not in the context of a partnership, right? So if I see someone with another company that creates something that I want to replicate, well, the IP laws prevent me from doing that without, suitable licensing or compensation. So that's really what the IP regime is about. It has nothing to do with two companies collaborating with each other and setting their own limits and guidelines to what technology is being shared. So this is just a bad example. Anyway, there is little prospect for unfair profits. 3 vaccines have already been authorized by Western regulators, and numerous Chinese and Russian vaccines are available. Many more vaccines will soon arrive, each competing for market share. But in such a competitive market, no single company will monopolize COVID vaccines or succeed in, quote, profiteering. So they seem to sort of implicitly imply that patent protection offers the chance of profiteering. But anyway, in 2 years, there could be 20 vaccines on the market. It's going to be difficult to charge a premium price. Okay, so what they're basically arguing here is that in a couple of years, maybe from 2022 onward, really they're not going to be able to charge a premium price on these vaccines, because if consumers have a choice, of which vaccines to use, they're going to pick the cheapest one, right? You know, assuming it's, you know, the emergency part of the pandemic is done. So what they basically need is to profiteer now, during the emergency moment of the vaccine, of the pandemic. That's when they're going to get the biggest amount of profits. But here's the thing. Why are they so obsessed with profits for products that were largely publicly funded? Here's a chart that appeared on the BBC a couple of months ago, which shows very clearly who has funded the COVID vaccines. And here's one thing that might not be apparent if you just take it at face value. So the blue bits, the blue squares, are the amounts that have been funded by governments, and the yellow non-for-profit groups, and red, ostensibly, is private. But here's the thing. So the government bit, involves direct government funding of the vaccine development process. But the red part isn't necessarily coming directly from the pockets of the vaccine manufacturers. In fact, much of this is because these vaccines received billions in pre-orders from governments. So this is indirectly being funded by the government itself. So what this makes it look like is that, you know, Pfizer and biotech only had this amount of government funding. The rest came out of their pockets, you know, good old private investment, untarnished by inefficient government funds. And this really relates to the BioNTech bit, which, as many of you might know, BioNTech received funding from the German government, while Pfizer famously rejected funding from Donald Trump's Operation Warp Speed, which was the major funding program for vaccines. In contrast, Moderna almost entirely funded its own vaccine effort through Operation Warp Speed. And here's the thing. This red was mostly pre-orders. So all the countries that made deals with Pfizer back in the summer of 2020, when it was still under the development, well, that's where it went, right? And a reminder, if you look at like the massive number of funding that AstraZeneca has put, AstraZeneca and Oxford, because this is, you know, the Oxford bit. This is in many cases funding for the production process. So it's not the R&D. This, what I mean is, this number, this 8.19 billion, is not the R&D, which is what I think many free marketeers would want you to think. So this is the expansion of productive facilities, etc. And we know that AstraZeneca has greatly expanded its production to it. So this, again, has nothing to do with IP protection. Nothing. If you are expanding a manufacturing plant, a vaccine manufacturing plant, what does this have to do with IP protection? Nothing. So the bulk of this private spending has indirectly been government, and much of it has not been related to R&D. So the case that somehow we wouldn't have these vaccines if IP protection didn't exist, and there was not an incentive to research, is just wrong. And here are some articles. That's from the US, 2 billion for 100 million doses of coronavirus vaccines. Again, this is not funding for the research. This has nothing to do with Operation Warp Speed. These are pre-orders, and you can see this is July 22nd, 2020, almost half a year before, you know, the first vaccine was actually applied to a human being. This was what helped finance this red bit here. And the same with AstraZeneca. 400 million doses were pre-ordered as of, this was May, so this was even earlier, this was May 2020. That's all the funding that they had already to produce the vaccine. So that's, again, that red bit. This is not IP related at all. So they are, if you're trying to profiteer out of an emergency situation from vaccines that were funded essentially by either direct government funding or government orders, you're being a complete hypocrite, right? You should not be complaining that you don't have, your year of emergency use in which you can charge a premium profit for a product that you really didn't spend out-of-pocket expenses on. So, opponents of IP have been shown to be wrong about COVID-19 vaccine research and pricing. Now they blame IP for holding up the manufacture of the billions of doses required to meet global demand. Yeah, that's kind of true. Because, so, very simple. Let's imagine that this is global vaccine production capacity. This is what's currently being used to produce coronavirus vaccines. Why? Because this encompasses only the companies that are producing, that have developed the vaccine, and those which have been given license by those companies. So, for example, the Serum Institute in India. If we were to waive IP, it is possible that this could grow. So it is true that not every country or every pharmaceutical, for example, generics makers, will have the technological capacity to make COVID vaccines, especially the more complicated ones like the mRNA vaccines. Although the other ones probably aren't that sophisticated, that would be significantly out of reach. They're not using technology that isn't known, or that's new, so to speak. So the argument here is COVID vaccines are complex biological products. They require huge levels of skill and know-how to manufacture, mostly held by companies as trade secrets. IP, such as patents, are not the most relevant factor here. Well, yes, they kind of are, because if you waive the IP for these vaccines, then others can replicate. We already have a knowledge of how these vaccines work. So, and even in the extreme case, because this is such a huge medical emergency, we can share the hard knowledge of that vaccine to others. We could make it public. All it takes is to publish a journal article pretty much detailing the blueprints of a vaccine, and I'm pretty sure that 90% of or more of vaccine manufacturers around the world could be able to pull it off. I mean, this is not, we're talking already that most countries don't have vaccine manufacturing capability, but the ones who do, the Brazils, the South Africas, the Indias, the Mexicos, they could do it. I mean, it's not conceivable that we would increase that share of vaccine capability significantly if these IPs were shared. I mean, this is like war. During World War II, the Allies shared technology. Why? Because often it was not possible to just receive equipment from one country. So they were given the ability to produce it, which maybe in peacetime they wouldn't have done, because they would have kept the trade secrets. They would have wanted to keep that technology to sell themselves. But in wartime, you needed another country to be able to produce it, right? So it's the same thing. This is as close as you can get to a wartime scenario with healthcare. So again, this argument just doesn't seem to hold. It's better for the owners of new COVID vaccines to license their manufacturers to partners with the skill and capacity to prove large quantities of high-quality products. These can be distributed at scale in low and middle income countries at an orderly transfer of knowledge and technology. Again, here's the problem. A part of these licensing deals will favor the countries where the manufacturing is going on. So, for example, the Serum Institute, which is producing the AstraZeneca vaccine, actually has exported about almost probably around, like 40% of the production of AstraZeneca vaccines in India has had to be exported, including to the UK. So that's the irony. You don't have the freedom to decide what to use those vaccines for. And what we would want is for the countries that manufacture vaccines, if they had an IP waiver and they could produce vaccines, well, they can supply their home markets. If they're countries like India that are currently going through a major COVID wave, or if they're sort of on the way out, they could export it, and they don't need specific licensing agreements on how they can export these things or not. So that's why an IP waiver is necessary. Anyway, again, here they argue in favor of voluntary licensing, which is what I'm claiming is not sufficient, because again, we would already, if this was the way to solve the problem, then pretty much all vaccine manufacturers would have already managed to voluntarily obtain some licensing scheme, which they haven't. So, but here's the part of this article that I really, really strongly object to. And even if you disagree with what I've already said here, this part is really the crux of the issue. A zero IP world would be a backward step and discourage companies from making urgently needed refinements to existing vaccines to combat new COVID-19 variants. Is this a joke? Like, how can you even make this claim? Like, so again, vaccines that have been largely publicly funded, directly or indirectly, these pharmaceuticals, if we had waived the IPs for these vaccine, they would just decide, you know what, new variant appeared, we're not gonna tweak it. Really? Like, that's odd. It would derail the dozens of vaccine manufacturing licensing deals. No, this is not true, because those deals will already be respected. You've already made so if IP waivers were enacted, this does not change, for example, the deal that the Serum Institute has with AstraZeneca. They were still, the issue is with the ones that don't have licensing deals. Throwing global supply chains into chaos. No, again, no, because there are already deals for the supply of materials to make those vaccines. So new companies that would be able to produce the vaccines would then set up more deals on obtaining the supplies of those vaccines. That's really the issue. Is there a situation where actually we could run out of vaccine supplies? Yes, of course. There could be certain limited reagents or other materials that we need, but this would presumably not affect the ones that already have deals to produce those reagents. It is conceivable that some companies, the ones at the tail end of producing vaccines, would find resources in short supply. But here's the deal. As I mentioned in a previous video, well, who are the countries that are actually restricting? So this clearly is coming from a very free market perspective, but there's no criticism at all of, for example, the US effectively restricting a lot of the this is suspension of the intellectual property protection. But the U.S. has also suspended the export of vaccine components, and India is currently strongly urging the U.S. to reverse these export bans. So who is constraining the supply chains? It's actually the vaccine producing countries who are doing it. So again, this does not make any sense at all. And it would take far longer than letting the manufacturing licenses that already exist get into their stride. Again, I don't see how this would be effective. But this is the more egregious bit. When the next pandemic comes, few companies will want to invest in new vaccines if they stand to have little control over the output. Again, as I explained, pharmaceutical companies are not producing, are not making research, and they're not producing the vaccine for a future disease that doesn't exist. Okay? And if we're doing this is an IP waiver. Keyword, waiver. We are not, no one here is arguing that the IP regime, the global IP regime, must be brought down permanently. Although I would probably agree that it should. Because IP is really the latest way in which Western countries basically apply protectionism and prevent less developed countries from obtaining technologies that they need. This is, when Western countries developed, there was no IP regime, no global IP regime. They could copy each other at will. And even up to the 60s, 70s, countries like Korea and Taiwan were famous. In fact, they were notorious and stereotyped for basically copying stuff that was that Western countries did. Japan as well. And China is accused of that now, too. And these were countries that used to basically be stereotyped as countries that just copied what Western countries did, often cheaper, occasionally better, until the point that they actually developed technologies that compete with the West. So that's how they did it. The current global IP regime is designed specifically to prevent third world countries from obtaining technology. And it's no surprise that when you look at the countries who have supported the IP waivers, it's mostly been developing countries. Every single African country has been a sponsor or co-sponsor or or supporter of the WTO waiving IP rights for COVID vaccines or other medical tools. And this is, the red circles, all Western countries, and occasionally, a fascist third world country like Brazil. So that's pretty much it. This is basically the slippery slope fallacy. It is like, if we suspend it now for this one emergency, this once in a generation, not even once in a generation, maybe once in a century pandemic, we can't violate the rules of capitalism just once, because it would just be it would derail the whole thing. All the incentives for producing vaccines would just go away, and that's ridiculous. And so the typical misguided calls to suspend IP rights sound high-minded, but the ethical appeal of such actions fades given the harm they would inflict on future generations and ourselves when we face a disease that is hard to cure now. As I explained, that is not true. We're only seeking these IP waivers for this specific circumstance. Instead of sowing division and creating major distractions at venues such as the WTO, distractions from what? What other, what's going on right now that is more important than the pandemic? Nothing. There's no distraction. Opponents of IP should stop the rhetoric. Yeah, just for guys who, for people who love free markets and free speech. It's surprising how little they want free speech when it's against free markets. The IP system has accelerated the end of the pandemic. False. It hasn't. It has delayed it. That's a fact. We should let it finish this critical job. So, now comes the fun part. What is the Geneva Network? Because I'd never heard of them. You know, I was Googling articles that were defending IP rights because I wanted to make a video on it, and it came up among one of the top search links. So I looked at who they are, and well, nothing about them should surprise us in any way. So, Geneva Network is a research and advocacy organization focusing on international innovation, trade, and development policy. We work with think tanks, scholars, and opinion leaders from all over the world. Why are we called Geneva Network? Geneva is an international city at the center of debate and innovative thinking on innovation, trade, development. So they're not based in Geneva. They're actually London based. But yeah, nice name. But here's the cool part. Let's look at who they are. So apparently they only have 5 people in their staff, one of them being their digital guy. So you only have 4 actual. I don't even want to call them researchers because this is not research. This is basically just lobbying. So Philip Stevens. Let's look at him. So he worked as Director of Policy for International Policy Network, a UK-based think tank, as well as holding research positions with the Adam Smith Institute and Reform, both in London. These are all basically free market libertarian. I mean, the Adam Smith Institute is notorious, one of the most notorious libertarian think tanks, not just in London, in the world. This one was the funniest one. So we have a professor. We have our token academic. Professor Mark F. Schultz is the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company Endowed Chair in Intellectual Property Law at the University of Akron School of Law. Could you make this like not even slightly plutocratic? I mean, if you have a chair in a university that is named after a company, I mean, what the hell? Like, there's just no effort being made at all to appear subtle. You could have picked anyone. You could have just given any name. Give it, the Friedrich Hayek chair. I don't know. That would at least sound slightly more respectable and less lobbyist. What can I say? And he was a co-founder and leader of the Center for Protection of Intellectual Property at George Mason University. Again, a very notorious libertarian-leaning, probably the most libertarian-leaning economics department in the U.S. I mean, these guys make the University of Chicago look decidedly socialist in comparison. So, there you go. And of course, we have our token academic, and we have our token brown person. So, professor at the Bennett University School of Business in India, and project experience in various groups. But here's the one that that caught my attention: Laffer Associates. So Laffer Associates is basically the consultancy or think tank or whatever you want to call it from Arthur Laffer. Arthur Laffer was pretty much the intellectual brainchild of trickle-down economics during the Reagan era, which had no empirical evidence, by the way. But he sort of had a bit of a public renaissance a bit during the Trump years. But he's still there. He's still been arguing, in favor of free market fundamentalism. So there you go, Laffer. And finally, Juan Carlos Hidalgo. And I have to say, what caught me most about the Geneva Network is that I know this guy, not personally, but I know him because in my previous job, and even to this day, I cover Costa Rica for the Economist Intelligence Unit. I still do work for them on Costa Rica, and he is a public figure, a Costa Rican public figure, which has a column in La Nación, Costa Rica's more influential daily, which is true. And he also works for El Gato, which is the Spanish language version of the Cato Institute. So super libertarian, like hyper libertarian. You often think that libertarianism is limited to the Anglo-Saxon world or the West in general, but rest assured there are some countries, and Costa Rica is strange because it's one of the countries that has, at least now it's sort of faded away, but it did have a rather influential libertarian party, which over time became slightly less fanatically libertarian, so just moved towards a more traditional right-wing agenda. But yeah, it's a rare case of a country that, so the US, for example, has a libertarian party, but they rarely win more than 3% of the vote, whereas the Libertarian Party in Costa Rica had seats in Congress, and I think they were either second or third place in a recent in an election sometime in the noughties. I don't remember off the top of my head which one. So they've sort of faded away a bit, but they were quite influential in the noughties and in the last decade. So there you go. These are the people who are behind this. So this is, I don't know what this is. This is not a think tank. This is not a. It's like a lobby group that sort of tries to attempt to look intellectual. They probably get tons of funding from pharmaceutical companies and other big pocketed groups. It would be great if the left had the opportunity to make groups like this, networks like this. I'd be filthy rich right now if I could start my sort of left-wing Geneva Network and get massive funding. But since no company will ever fund a left-wing think tank, there you go. So good for them. But as you can see, and here's the funny part. This argument about IPs and IP waivers has mostly been, like I said at the beginning, a left-right issue. But occasionally you see an argument from the right that actually is critical of the patent system. And here's the irony. One of them comes from the Cato Institute. So the Cato Institute, which is one of the most well-known libertarian think tanks, Washington D.C. based, and very, in every once in a blue moon, they will come out with something that shows even the slightest bit of empathy. And this was from April of last year, so at the very start of the first wave of the pandemic. We need a coronavirus vaccine. Patents might slow the process. And they actually argue, they make pretty much the point that I'm making, which is, yes, we need, well, not the point that I'm making, because I'm very critical of the global IP regime, but they're arguing that basically it won't be a massive, the slippery slope fallacy of suspending IP during this emergency is not really a big deal in the long run. And actually they use an anti-nationalistic argument against vaccines, because I guess at this time in April, this was well before we really had news that some were being or close to being successful. There was, I guess, this idea that it was going to be pretty much a sort of a nationalistic race to see who comes out with it first. So, their concluding paragraph, I think, was quite good. We will all be harmed if vaccines are part of a nationalistic economic competition with governments and inventors seeking monopolies over vital health products that are needed by the whole world. Governments should pool resources to promote the rapid development and distribution of effective treatments and a vaccine for COVID-19. So, yeah, there you have it. Not all libertarians. But I think the case for IP waivers in an emergency is very robust. I think the reliance on slippery slope arguments from the right just basically, and they always use slippery slope arguments for pretty much everything. That's why it's called a fallacy, slippery slope fallacy. Look it up, because if you have no evidence that it actually will lead to the slippery slope that you're describing, then your argument pretty much falls apart. So I'm a bit pessimistic on this. I don't think that Western countries are going to have a change of heart and suddenly decide to do IP waivers. But in the long run, I think if there is sufficient global anger at the system, we could maybe have reform and change in the longer run. Because it'll be a repeat of the AIDS epidemic, when we had millions of people dying in Africa every year, and Western countries simply refusing for these countries to obtain cheaper retroviral drugs, cheaper generic retroviral drugs, and it led to changes in policy. This led to changes in WTO policy, to TRIPS policies, which is the sort of the element of trade that is related to intellectual property protection. But it's clearly not enough. It's clearly not working in the case of a global pandemic. So again, I hope I'm wrong. I hope they do decide to waive IPs sooner rather than later, because millions of people are going to die in 2021 because of this. We could have more vaccines. We should have more vaccines. The entire global effort at producing vaccines should be dedicated to producing vaccines for coronavirus, but they're not. So hopefully, if we don't have a good outcome now, it'll lead to sufficient outrage for the system to change in the long run. And that's all I have to say. If you like this video, like and subscribe. It's a new channel, and if you like this content, rest assured I will be making more of it. Thank you very much.